The meaning of force. When we do something for too long, we grow weary and end up with no force. Some people find difficulty in separating their idea of workforce from the idea of physical force. However, there are many kinds of force that act upon us. From a work point of view, when an individual is completely asleep, they have no force. In other words, they lack workforce and are therefore completely immersed in life. All force is made through some form of self-knowledge, and all workforce must be made in this way. You can be enormously powerful in physical stature, a colossus, and yet from a work point of view have no force at all for anything else. In trying to understand how force is made available to us, we have to study first what makes us lose force. This may perhaps not be starting far back enough though, because those who interpret force as being entirely physical will not understand what meaning is implied when the work speaks of force in other areas. Workforce is that which keeps us awake, and here it is difficult to understand what that means if we have always lived our life completely identified with ourselves, and therefore enraptured or fast asleep. Of course, we are oblivious to any force deficit if we are completely asleep, if we are simply a function of our personality, and if we are identified with what we are in life, what we have, and what we do. If that is the case, then we would fail to understand what force means in a work sense. Trying then to simplify the role of force, we have in us different centers, and each center requires a different kind of energy or force for it to work properly. There is, for example, the force of moving center. A person might have great energy connected with their moving center, work out relentlessly at the gym every day, but no energy for their intellectual center, in which case they'd simply be a dumb ox or a brute that is emotionally bankrupt. If such a person uses all of their force, say in moving center, they will not understand what it means to have force available for their intellectual center. Forces or energies in us are of different kinds, just as the fuel for combustion is of different grades. If we grasp the idea that there are different kinds of energies and forces within us, then it's easier to understand the more complete teaching about force which the work offers. The idea of balanced man that dominates this work is that of an individual who has force that can pass at different times into different centers. A balanced person is someone that can use all of their centers at the appropriate times. A one-centered individual, a one-sided person, employs their force, such as they have stored up in accumulators, mechanically, and therefore chiefly in one center. The work advises, however, that we must eventually come to the point of being able to use all of our centers simultaneously, with their appropriate energies. Otherwise, we remain ungrown, an undeveloped and stunted or a lopsided thing. We have 5 ordinary centers: an intellectual center, an emotional center, a sex center, moving center, and the instinctive center. A complete or balanced individual has, at the appropriate times, force collected in all of these 5 centers, and that force is quite different in each case, a different grade of energy. You cannot, for example, use intellectual force for lifting weights at the gym. A quite different kind of force has to be employed. The balancing of our machine, the equilibrium in centers, depends upon the right appropriation of force among those different centers, horses for courses. Someone that ordinarily lives a very one-sided existence, using, as it were, the same quality of force, becomes tired and often lethargic. They find everyday life exhausting and are done for at sunset. However, there are other centers, other forces that can be used when one is tired in one center. The trouble is that when we are tired in one center, we feel tired, so that is the end of it. It is like walking up and down the same path at the park. However, when you are tired in one center, you are not necessarily tired in another center. We can find ourselves mentally tired and unable to think straight or write for the time being, but if we shift into moving center, stand up and go for a walk in the park, there's plenty of force there. We mostly, however, have a pattern of life to which we stick too rigidly and which confines us to a very narrow range of experience, of meaning. Every center has its own different kind of meaning, and every center conducts its own meaning. We tend, though, to live in one pattern of meaning and fail to realize that we can experience other meanings that are waiting for us in some other center, or part of a center that we have not used for quite some time. P.D. Ouspensky would say that people tend not to study how to pass from one center to another, or from one part of a center to another part of that same center. He said that a certain kind of effort is necessary in order to pass from one center to another, and if we could just find that way for ourselves, we'd find that we have more energy and greater force. He had his own methods that he employed to accomplish this, and said that the first thing for us to understand is that it is possible to pass from one center to another, or from one part of the same center to a different part, and that unless an individual understands this, they will not realize the possibilities that lie latent within them. Not realizing that some center or part of a center can have force, we tend to feel exhausted when we need not be exhausted. The reason being that we live in a kind of rigid pattern of life, following the same neurological pathways, and so always doing the same thing over and over again. In other words, we live in very small parts of centers. Ouspensky would talk a great deal about thinking differently, noting that if an individual were to begin to think differently, they would at once release force because their thinking has changed from one part of their intellectual center to another. However, most people do not understand what it means to think differently from the way they have always thought. Suppose you have noticed that you are thinking of a person in a certain way, quite mechanically, as you always have done, and that these thoughts give you no force. Suppose even that you have become sufficiently sensitive to your inner life so as to realize that you are really losing force by thinking of this very person in this usual and unproductive manner. Then, say that you apply the work to yourself at this particular moment and put yourself into that person's position. Or even better, go so far as to think that you are that person yourself, and that you are perhaps just like them. This will of course change your thinking, and you will then move into a higher part of your intellectual center, where suddenly you may find that you receive force because you are thinking in a new way. This is an example of gaining force by applying the work to yourself. After a time in the work, we begin to tire of our customary thought patterns, the thoughts that we tend to go with every day. We realize that it's possible to think in a new way about everything, and here can begin by including ourselves in that process. It is liberating to realize that you can think differently, both about other people and about yourself, about your past and about your present life. The trouble is that we simply accept our thoughts, believing that they are quite correct, that they are the only possible thoughts that we can have. There are, of course, a million different narratives, and much depends upon which we choose to validate. Notice the rigid individual who always thinks in the same set manner, usually says the same things, and expresses the same opinions, like a parrot. Notice yourself in this regard, and ask yourself, are you a parrot? We can all think quite differently and are simply using, most of the time, only one possible line of thought, where there are a million different ways of approaching the same issue. Imagine that you are full of prejudices, crystallized attitudes, smugness, vanity, pride and self-esteem, with which you thoroughly agree and are of course thoroughly satisfied. If you are such a person, then can you expect to change and to undergo any sort of inner development? Such an individual would always be the same person, say the same things, always express the same views, and take all experience in a stereotypical manner. They are no good from a work point of view, because being quite satisfied does not lead the way to self-change. The key to self-change lies in observing oneself, observing how we talk, what opinions we constantly repeat, what we condemn in others always, what we are extremely vain and proud of, and so on. One cannot change otherwise, because if you take yourself for granted as being quite right, then you cannot change. What in the world for? What has to be changed in this work on self is that we ourselves need to change. We have to realize that much of the time we are nothing but mechanical parrots. You yourself must see that you are doing these things and behaving in a predictable manner, following the same stereotypical patterns time and time again. That is why the work says that unless we can begin to realize our mechanicalness, we can never really remember ourselves. Which is exactly why, if you take yourself for granted, thinking that you yourself can be the starting point, that you are acceptable just as you are, quite well situated, with all the right ideas, the right forms of life, the right attitudes, and so on, you will never be able to change and will fail to grasp what this work is all about. If you begin to develop a sincere observing eye, which is impossible unless you feel the work emotionally, sensing your own lack of knowledge and being, then after a time you will feel rather unhappy about the state of affairs and the kind of person that you are. We make the mistake of seeking to start from ourselves as being in excellent shape, just as we are. Life has built up in us all certain kinds of individuals, which is based upon their life experience and personality. You may be very good at making shirts, or knitting socks, at gardening, being a doctor, or a qualified engineer, wonderful mother, a good father, effective soldier, a good typist, or an efficient clerk, successful businessman, or an outstanding anything you like in life, a good wife, a good husband, or a good sibling with regard to doing your duty as taught you, and so acquired from your culture, religion, and environment. How do you escape, though, from all of this, because that is your prison? Of course, if you do not want to escape from any of it and feel quite content with life, then there is no reason why you should do this work or try to study it. If we are quite satisfied with ourselves, such as we are, then we really cannot do any work, and it is of no use our studying it. Because our buffers, pride, self-conceit, vanity, and so on will be so great that nothing can shift in us. That is exactly why it is so difficult to teach the idea of a further development that esotericism speaks of, a second education, in which personality has to be rendered passive. We have to come to the realization gradually that we are absolutely nobody, nothing but a kind of contraption. This again is extremely difficult, and if anyone cannot observe themselves from a work point of view, they will not be able to shift from themselves, so will find no extra force, no work force, but only life force. Life force is that which creates personality and then sustains it, day after day. And this is absolutely necessary for the first development, that first education of a human being, their first interactions after material incarnation. However, there is another force called work force, the force of esoteric teaching, a force that we find spoken of in every page of the Gospels, force that leads to a second rebirth. Work on self is about just that transformation of being, which means becoming a new person and born again. This work can eventually conduct to us, if we receive it and think it sufficiently important, an entirely new valuation of ourselves, and an entirely different realization of the meaning of life. You will then see that you are nothing but an automaton such as you are, which indeed is the whole point of work. Because this work is not about life and what it has turned us into, save indirectly, but it's a further transformation that everyone, having fulfilled their duties in life as good householders, could eventually undergo. A transformation cannot be undertaken unless we feel that we have come to the very end of things, to the fulfillment of duty, to the peak of our own excellence, to the pinnacle of science, to the aim of all worldly knowledge, and yet feel that there must be something else apart from what life has made for us by birth and through training. Life cannot be explained by life. Nothing can be explained in terms of itself. Nature cannot be explained in terms of herself, and you cannot explain yourself in terms of yourself. Simply ask, how do you think? How do you move? How do you feel? Can you explain any of this? Most people do not trouble themselves with thoughts of that nature, and a great many think that talk of this kind is simply morbid. They advise you to consult a doctor, seek therapy, or find counseling somewhere. However, if you have such thoughts, then you already possess magnetic center, which is a sign of being, because someone who has magnetic center, even if they have accomplished very little in life, is then superior in their being to another who has achieved great success, attributing everything to themselves, and therefore witnessed no mystery. All workforce starts from magnetic center in a certain sense, and we cannot gain new force without that which magnetic center leads into eventually. A feeling of mystery leads us to a certain turning point, and we cannot reach workforce unless we feel something else apart from the material world and visible life, from shovels, bricks, or accounts, and so on. If you are quite content with your food, income, wonderful house, children, your excellent disposition, immaculate virtue, respectability, fine career, and so on, your prowess at life in general, then you possess no magnetic center. Listening to or watching the media, one wonders whether anyone has magnetic center in high authority, in politics, and in corporate leadership. It seems that most think they can do, and that all the electorate want is more regulation, more rules, and more science to produce the perfect technological utopia for them. Someone asleep in life, a person who has no magnetic center, will be quite content to become a doctor, scientist, or a general. Their force will be derived from life entirely, from their successes, and they will rub their hands, telling you that they did all this or accomplished all that, which is tedious but unfortunately very common. Such an individual, appearing on chat shows or on breakfast television, will not think for a moment that they are all the time attributing everything to themselves. They do not see that life has made them what they are, and will think themselves very good people, excellent entrepreneurs, admirable leaders, highly trained professionals performing their duty, and yet this is exactly where the dividing line comes between someone that can understand this work and others who could never understand it. It takes an exceptional person to admit, whatever their reputation in life might be, that they know nothing really, and to feel themselves to be insignificant. Some kettles are very small and soon filled. This work seeks people who wish to find something other than what life has made them. No one can make any force in the work sense if they are completely identified, satisfied with themselves, vain and proud, or content with life such as it is. It would be quite useless to try to convince them otherwise, because such people derive the feeling of themselves from their life achievement, and we can only create force in a work sense by not being identified with ourselves. We can fall under a new range of forces which are wonderful, providing a strange and curious feeling of empowerment, only as long as we do not identify with all that we have done in life already. Of course, we have not technically done all that we attribute to ourselves. It has been done to us through circumstances, outside forces, and outside necessity. So if we derive our feelings of ourselves from all that we have gone through in this sense, we will never be able to experience that strange force of work acting upon us. Look at your pride, weigh your vanity, assess your meritoriousness, self-satisfaction, virtuousness, respectability, and everything of that kind that life has built up in you. Do you gain your feeling of yourself from all of that, or have you something in you that rather dislikes it all and feels that it's not really you? If so, then you can begin to draw force from the work. However, you must increase that feeling of dislike, of not accepting yourself as life has made you. You must not derive your feeling of I, a feeling of yourself, from all of that if you really want to change. Because as long as you hold on to it all and take yourself as it, thinking, what a fine fellow am I, then you will be identifying with personality and more likely with false personality. As long as this takes place in you, as long as that reflects your internal situation day by day and minute by minute, there is no place in which the work can enter you. Because at every moment, you are reinforcing that vain, conceited feeling of yourself derived from what you were or are in the walk of life. As long as life is your neutralizing force, as long as life is the force that makes you go and makes you do everything, then it keeps your personality active, which of course includes false personality. It keeps the real part of you that can grow, your essence, passive. This work is about bringing in a new neutralizing or third force, whose ultimate objective is to change the relationship of essence to personality, in effect reversing it altogether. Many foolish things are said about giving up our lives, and many wandering souls go into monasteries or experiment with various austerities. This way, work on self lies within life, and the secret is not to identify with what you were or are in life. You have to start all over again and be reborn. The better kind of person you were in life, the better your potential. If you can but understand what it means to render your personality passive. It is through making personality passive that essence, or the real part of you, can grow. Because personality is like the yolk of an egg, then essence is the germ that can grow at the sacrifice of the yolk. All workforce is derived from the realization of the ideas that work teaches, that a new birth is possible. Many people who have been in contact with the work are no longer quite the same as before. They find that in the atmosphere of the work, it is very little use to bring in life experience from personality, or particularly from false personality. They find they cannot boast of what they have done in quite the same way as people in life do. The gradual sacrifice of this yoke of personality so that the germ of essence can grow is one reason why a work atmosphere must be created. An atmosphere in which we can really laugh at ourselves sometimes. Can you laugh at yourself? Even the slight change that takes place in people who have a fairly good attitude to work is often remarkable. Why does this happen? It happens because the atmosphere of the work is different from the atmosphere of life. Technically, the third force of life, which keeps personality active and essence passive, is slightly changed, and some parts of personality begin to be sacrificed. Then, owing to this, essence begins to grow, so people become more real to one another. If we were all more in essence than we are at present, everything would become much more real, much more genuine, much more simple, much more true, and we'd sense much more good in others. When you try to increase what you have been, and to feel bigger and stronger and more powerful, more important, then you are going in the reverse direction of this work. Then you will find no force in a work sense. Such a state means that you are very identified with yourself, with your personality, which ascribes everything to itself. You will not get workforce from that identification with the self, and can only get workforce through non-identifying, through self-observation, and through dissolving those pictures, those ideas, the wonderfully proud and meritorious imagination about yourself. The reason for this is quite simple. What prevents our two higher centers, which are continually working within, higher mental center and higher emotional center, from transmitting their force to us? They cannot get through to us owing to our self-admiration, our personality, which blankets essence, the seed or germ. All workforce comes indirectly from these two higher centers, which are at a higher level of being than we are, a level beyond personality. Remember that work teaches that they are fully developed and that they are transmitting messages to us constantly, but we cannot hear them owing to our state of sleep. There is something in us that is trying to change the whole time and cannot get through owing to the buffers and blocking. This blackout is due to personality, but mostly to an overbearing false personality. If a person begins to work on themselves through their own self-observation, if they begin to observe their inner sleep and their vanity, to observe their meritoriousness, their negative emotions, their pictures of themselves, if they begin to observe their bias and prejudices, their mechanical opinions, stereotypical talking, chattering, and evil banter, then they will begin to be separated from these things. Because if you can observe a thing, you are no longer it. This is the first step in separation that the work teaches. One has to observe, but the ultimate issue is that if we are identified with ourselves, such as we are, if we are taking all our thoughts as real, and will not see that we have to separate ourselves from many bad moods, negativity, aggravation, irritability, and bad self-feelings, then we will get nowhere in this work. The method of work is through non-identifying with ourselves. We must learn not to identify with ourselves by observing the self and then separating into me and I. What is your self? The self is psychological, the self is psychic. Yourself is whatever you like to call it, but it is not physical and not your body. It belongs to what you are conscious of, so are you going to put your consciousness into negative thoughts or an evil mood? Are you going to put your consciousness into self-satisfaction, self-glorification, or are you going to put your consciousness into feeling that you are always right and know best? Unless you observe yourself, you cannot notice where you place your consciousness. We find ourselves with many feelings, many moods, and many thoughts that come to us mechanically, that we should not put our consciousness into. For example, we should not put any feeling of I into hate or the feeling of hopelessness. We should not consent to them and not go with them. If we do this, then we will get workforce, but if we are simply ourselves, taken for granted, totally identified with that self, then we will get no workforce at all, because we will be under the third force of life and not the third force of work. There is spirit and there is matter, to use phrases that do not belong to this system. A person must develop spiritually, and this means in the work psychologically. We are all given bodies, spirit incarnate, of different sizes, and that is not our fault, it is destiny. So do not pride yourselves on them. However, the work is talking about a psychological inner development, where truth counts for so much more. Suppose you are trying to build up a second body that we have been advised to develop in this work, a psychological body. That body is based upon truth, on sincerity. Then imagine that you have a negative emotion against someone. This means immediately that you will have erroneous connections in your psychological body that survives after death, if it is able to. So you have a psychological body all wrongly connected because negative states make you lie. If you notice, when you are negative, you are continually lying. Have you attained the strength to see that you are lying by tasting negative emotion? Understand that this work is about building up truth in us, not moral truth in an orthodox sense, not truth from a particular kind of fundamentalist belief system, but real truth through inner sincerity. That is why the work starts with self-observation, uncritical and absolutely sincere. This builds up gradually in us, a transmitting instrument, a psychological apparatus that can conduct the influences of higher centers. Because higher centers that are always working can only reach us when there is the resonance of truth within. For that reason, many of us have to go through what are called very disturbing experiences of inner sacrifice, to get rid of our false personality, our meritoriousness, vanity, and prejudice. This is the meaning of intifada, the holy war within ourselves. Prejudice is quite useless as it conducts nothing. Meritorious feelings are even worse, because to ascribe to yourself excellence in any form will make it impossible for higher centers to come through to you. Some who call themselves Christians should reflect upon the Sermon on the Mount to consider what is meant there, as far as they are able to. We will get no force in a work sense unless we work against personality and do not identify with the kind of person that we take ourselves as being, because quite simply, we are not what we think we are. All workforce is derived from going against yourself, by going against your natural mechanical reaction in the moment. However, every individual must have a private feeling of work in their hearts and in their minds, so that even when they are alone, they do not consent to mechanical negative thoughts, and externally do not talk mechanically about other people in the work. If this is sincerely done, then we can produce, perhaps, a real work atmosphere finally, to which everyone contributes, and if it drops, then people can ask themselves sincerely what they said, what they did, and why their workforce has apparently leaked.